Signore e signori, buonasera. Welcome to New York University, Casa Italiana Zerilli Marimò. For this event, there is a sort of a premiere in the sense that it's the first time that there is a public presentation outside of the strictly speaking academic world, where the author we are discussing tonight, Pier Vittorio Tondelli, is quite known and his books are used in some courses. But basically outside of that, it's almost completely unknown, also due to the fact that his books have never been translated in the United States. There is only one of his books translated into English, but in England. And therefore, some of you might wonder, then why are you having a presentation on an author that we cannot read in English? Well, because we would like you to read it in English, and we would like to propose this author to the attention of publishers and editors for consideration, because we believe that he's an author that still has a lot to say. He had a very short life. He was born in 1952 and died in 1996. And the author that we have talked to discuss and to present to the American public, ideally, Pier Vittorio Tondelli, is Father Antonio Spadaro. And Pier Vittorio Tondelli was, from the very beginning, a very sensational author. His first book was condemned in a tribunal of the state for blasphemy against religion. And it's interesting that the first author who writes an entire book on this writer happens to be a Jesuit priest that will later become the editor-in-chief of Civiltà Cattolica, the most ancient cultural journal in Italy. Could we not have a presentation? Of course we had to. And I followed Padre Spadaro's work as a literary critic and as a cultural critic more at large from the very beginning. I actually wrote my first review of his first book that was on Tondelli in 2003 for Civiltà Cattolica. And I think he provides a reading of Tondelli, and I'm not going to anticipate anything, I'm going to leave it to him, that is not what some people expected just before reading his book, that being a priest and a Jesuit, he would like baptize, normalize, Christianize Tondelli. Is exactly the opposite operation. He's trying to understand from the sources, from the notes, from having access to Pier Vittorio Tondelli's own library and the notes on, that he hand wrote on books, on his Bible and on many others, to try to understand the complexity of the thought of this author. Father Spadaro has published many books. I would say I'm not going to mention the titles, but the areas of interest. So there is one area that is cyber theology, that is how to communicate in today's world anything that has to do with spirituality, with God, with the transcendental. Literature occupies a central role in his production and in his reflection, and that is in great part American literature. Carver, Flannery O'Connor, Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, many other, not only the traditional writers, but also singing poets, as we can say. And then, of course, in his role as one of the closest collaborators of Pope Francis, there are also several books that are interviews and dialogues with Pope Francis about very, very central topics. And in his role as editor-in-chief of Civiltà Cattolica in the last few years, he had to build for himself also another expertise that I think he did very well in that as well. That is geopolitical understanding of the dynamics of today's world. And he does that with a great deal of attention and precision, and at the same time, always with the spirit of somebody who is well versed in literature. But if you know how to read literature, you then learn how to read the world. And I think in his tenure as director of Civiltà Cattolica, you can really see that, the developing of this other area of interest in international geopolitical affairs. And I'm going to introduce his interlocutor as soon as Father Spadaro is going to be done with his presentation. And for the presentation, Father Spadaro will speak from here, from the podium, and then we ask Jeremiah Clapp, an actor, to be with us and to read the longer excerpts from Tondelli. So you'll hear Father Spadaro offering his presentation, and then when you hear Jeremiah, that's the voice of Pier Vittorio Tondelli, translated in part by Father Spadaro and in part by Michael Moore, who is right there, and then we'll ask him a thing or two about translating Tondelli into English. And so after the presentation of Father Spadaro, we're going to have Alessandro Giammei that I'm going to introduce in due time. And then there's going to be time for discussion, and if you have any question, it's going to be the time for asking them. And now, without further ado, please welcome Father Antonio Spadaro.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you, Stefano, for your wonderful presentation. And I'm very glad to be here because I can share with you part of my years of studies of this figure, which was very relevant for me, for my formation. And because for Pier Vittorio Tondelli, literature was a human experience. And literature in general is a human experience, and like life itself is never a neutral body. This is the lesson that Pier Vittorio gave loyally and consistently, to the point of filling his own pages, as we read in his last novel, Separate Rooms, with jealousy and shame. In fact, he wrote, he feels that that book and other books that he has written are like his body stripped of clothes. Dealing with Pier Vittorio Tondelli means coping with an intense, though brief literary production due to his author's death for AIDS in 1991 at the age of 36. The start of his work caused a scandal, as Stefano told us before, from the very beginning, because of the censorship of his first book, Altri, libertini, other libertines, considered by the judiciary to be a luridly blasphemous work. So it's very embarrassing for me to be here representing it. A book that violently stimulates readers to depravity and contempt for religion. Tondelli's literary parable begins so with this book, Altri libertini, a collection of 6 stories of beautiful and damned young people. The cipher for understanding libertinism and the on-the-road adventures is explicitly salvation, this is the word he uses, which merges with the theme of returning to a lost Eden. The engine of this journey is the restless consciousness of my frayed boots, a kind of descent into hell happens.
It's cold and raining cold for days now, and the icy glaze crushes nights at the tables of the Posto Ristoro with his seedy violet light, moldy neon, railroad smell, and reddish yellow dust slowly settling on the windows and stools, as well as in the shiftless public air that we breathe. Bored out of our minds. Damn winter, damn nights at the railroad station, making small talk and playing card games with their glasses full on the tables. Burnt out friends think this is how you survive December. All it takes is a bottle that's always full. Well, as long as you've got weed.
However, upon closer inspection in these writings, there is a need for a further dimension toward which one travels in a kind of adventures absolute.
With your nose in the air, smell the wind. Rend the clouds on the horizon. Come on, it's time to go. Come on, off we all go together on the adventure.
The ideal conclusion of the volume will be that the root of the love of life does not belong to the libertine. I think the person who really loves life is not the libertine. It's the monk, because he seeks the absolute. The sense of need, scarcity, waiting, and searching is given above all by this wild openness to beyond. In other libertines, the pride that prevents one from waiting for salvation is missing. Here one needs an intervention that can implement a process of redemption. The season in hell, to recall Arthur Rimbaud, takes shape and form thanks to a perception similar to that of Blaise Pascal. The characters interpret themselves as scraps, scartini in Italian, scraps in the universe. However, their marginality in relation to the world of normal life, only creates a situation of fellowship and solidarity, but also bring to life the expectation of a generous elsewhere. It dominates the desperate exercise of the young body having sex, which ends not in the conquest of Eden, but in a torment of insecurities and disappointments. In Pao Pao, the second book of Tondelli, the wandering through path we don't know in desperate search for something that can unlock the meaning of events dominates.
But the circumstances of life are never so astounding in their senseless fragmentation that they cannot one fine day be brought together miraculously in a subtle, delicate liberation, a vibration that retunes, reknits, and unifies the tones of the different pathways. And then, despite the pains and the precariousness of our youthful years, life seems to reveal itself as a mysterious and harmonious frequency that unlocks meaning and makes you understand. In that dazzling moment, everything seems to come together in the joy of finally feeling present in the eyes of your own history.
He is talking about more than the link created by imagination between instants of life. The anthropology that underlies Pao Pao considers the human being as lost in the universe, bewildered, but aware that he has not within him a restlessness that always urges him, her, to find a way out that will save him or her from meaningless wandering. The meaning is there, but it's often not unveiled. What can disclose it is a mysterious and harmonic frequency. The mysterious and harmonious frequency that unlocks meaning and makes you understand. It's so true for the life of ours, I think, all of us. The call to mystery says that human being, a small scrap in the universe, is not curled up hopelessly on himself, but is open to meaning. Waiting in the precarious conditions, even the generously abnormal sexuality and the herd bonding shows us the search for a territory of authenticity, of giving, of communication without barriers, in a context marked by desolation for all that belongs to this world. Tondelli had immersed himself in the context of the 80s, marked by the exit from the primacy of the political sphere and immersion in the vortex of cultural and media postmodernism. Of this society set on spectacularization, of the stuttering grand menagerie, gran serraglio balbuziente in Italian. So hard to translate these expressions, but this is a good challenge for you. This is why probably Tondelli is not translated into English yet. It was translated into French, into Spanish, Catalan, German, other languages, but not in English. So of this society set on the spectacularization of the stuttering grand menagerie, he becomes a careful witness and diarist in a series of articles, interviews, lectures, and stories that appeared in various newspapers and magazines during the decade. Much of his journalistic and narrative production has been collected in 2 volumes. A Postmodern Weekend, the first one, Chronicles from the 80s, and Abandonment, L'Abbandono, Tales from the 80s, which are part of a project named after the first of the 2, Un Weekend Postmoderno, a Weekend Postmodern Weekend. The project represents a journey, he wrote, a journey by fragments, reportage, inner illuminations, reflections, participatory and direct descriptions. It is a journey into the Italian province among its theater groups, artists, filmmakers, video artists, garage bands, cartoonists, advisors, and trendy fauna. It is a journey understood as a postmodern weekend. It was precisely in the 80s that the use of the term postmodern became widespread in Italy. But what is Tondelli's postmodernism? In an article, he uses the term middle postmodern, by which he defines the cultural context of the mid-80s, that of the joyful and eclectic fauna. First of all, it is presented as a swirling mixing of all pre-existing looks, vorticoso missaggio di tutti i looks preesistenti. Swirling mixing of all pre-existing looks. Postmodernism is understood as a combination of styles from different backgrounds. The swirl of with images generates a fluttering of combinations, fluttuare delle combinazioni, from which any form of definition and identity is alien. The fractured, broken, essentially pre-alphabetic and geographical iconic language generates a syncopated and noisy discourse. In the context of this broken logos, every substantial nexus, every bridge between present, past, and futures seems to be broken, while spatial distances are nullified by globalization homologation that made the capitalist world a single here. The phenomenology of postmodernism in Tondelli's work appears to be very rich, amused, ironic, dramatic. In 1990, writing about the previous decade, the question will be as follows.
Were the 1980s merely the decade of social climbing, individualism, the electronic revolution, the triumph of image over content and of appearances and forms over substance? When we think back on the recently concluded decade, will the only thing conjured up by our imaginations be yuppies and Paranini, TV quizzes and fashion? Will these have been the year solely of weak thought and the muscular physiques of Rambo and Schwarzenegger? Of disco dancing and acid music? Of mass vacations to Ibiza and Malindi?
It's interesting because in this quotation there's he called about imagination and he quoted yuppies and paninari. How do you translate paninari into English? I have no idea. Anyway, the critical eye sees
There's a song in English, Father, called Paninari by the Pet Shop Boys.
Okay, so paninari is perfect. It works. Amazing. Anyway, you say panini is perfect. You use panini also in English, I guess. The critical eye sees the prominent aspects, but mostly the disguises of emptiness. Tondelli describes and sings of a postmodern with which, in many respects, he does not identify. Tondelli writes further in Rockstar.
I am annoyed and completely turned off by all of this dressing up, putting on makeup, getting decked out, this depressing and despairing circus. It makes me nauseous, almost terminally ill. This is why I have come to believe that the most meaningful look is the one that's invisible. That the greatest emotion in terms of image is given to us by normal young people. That the blank image, like the blank page, holds more information or possible information than any saturation of the visual field through gadget pins, Madonnas, greyhounds, and tangerines.
The polychromatic lights of postmodernity are extinguished in the objective presence of death, in the face of which the culture of those years is unable to utter a word of salvation, as Tondelli lucidly wrote upon the death of cartoonist, very well known, Andrea Pazienza in 1998. That is at the end of the middle postmodern. Pazienza developed a personal body of work alternating between playful comic cartooning, at times politically charged, and much more elaborate, dark, disturbing graphic novels, often dealing with drugs and wanton violence, with a scattering of black humor. Tondelli writes about him. This is what Andrea's death places before me, ruthlessly, the negative side of a culture and a generation that have never really believed in anything except in their own damnation. Pazienza had absorbed the negative mythologies of the 70s, which are then those of never thinking about the future, never making plans, living for the day, and many other things. These are the mythologies of the generation without a cultural identity that in the end preferred to mix cultural sources, putative fathers, until it came to the co-presence of the opposites. For Tondelli, the topicality of the 80s reveals a euphoria that ends up masking a great emptiness of meaning. The critique came to be fierce in 1991.
Rock, movies, television, newspapers have helped to spread behaviors that the public, which is naive and in various degrees, has inevitably tried to imitate. In this way, marriages, outfits, divorces, separations, wedding lists, menus, vacation spots, favorite sports, and personality tics are imitated in an attempt to belong to what used to be called, in an expression that is maybe old-fashioned but effective, the jet set. And everyone applauds. Everyone seems to enjoy it. As long as it's a game, this snobbery can be fun, but when it becomes corrupt, all that remains is that one ancient resource that saved humanity in the past, staying home like all the many scribes.
Shutting oneself in, chiudersi in casa, Tondelli writes. Thus the need of a return to a home arises. There is a geographical icon that effectively shows how Tondelli was actually able to accomplish a form of unmasking emptiness, insubstantiality, and a movement of returning to what lies behind the scene. This geographic icon is represented in Rimini, the novel that takes its title from the place where people roast as if in a hellish bedlam.
I want Rimini to be like Hollywood, like Nashville, a place in my imagination where dreams are thrown overboard, people kill themselves with pills, love, triumph, or die. I want ruthless novels about success, cowardice, compromises one makes to get ahead. I want a boiling swamp of souls who go on vacation only to die and fry themselves in the sun. It is in this swamp that my heroes want to get ahead, to be somebody. It is here that they want success, wealth, notoriety, fame, glory, power, and sex. And Rimini is this Italy where you are either in or out. The masses bake and brown. The heroes fire their rounds at God.
However, the perspective of the novel is by no means that of a carnival. Tondelli said, Rimini is an absolutely nocturnal book. No one in this novel looks like having fun. In short, it contains the exact opposite of what has been believed. Tondelli captures the sense of a hurried frenzy, but one devoid of duration. Those who represent in art this life of Riviera and vacation compose nothing but, he wrote, portraits of an estranged landscape, used as a metaphor for the human condition, the expectation of change, of liberation from the greed of provincial life, from erotic obsessions, from oneself, from the precariousness of youth. The metaphor of the winter beach thus unveils the dynamics of the human condition, strained between diversion and need. Describing and recounting beach towns can thus mean to recount more fully the essence of a whole region, and maybe of the solids and the voids, the frenzy and the waiting, the explosion and the reordering of our lives. The movement, then, is from the frenzy of amusement to the stillness of a more inner dimension. It's a kind of return from escape to the discovery of the secret life of the real. However, a need for return imposes itself, understood as a metaphorical movement with meditative and bluesy tones. In this novel, Rimini, the character Bruno as a priest, Father Anselm, as a reference figure. He addresses Bruno with these words.
There is one fact to consider, that you are seeking God and it's not enough for you that you found Him. You would like a different life, to stop and rest in God, but you won't do this because nothing will ever be enough for you. Many see a small fissure where you find cracks and chasms. You will seek God your whole life long, and that will be enough to save you. Never stop seeking, but know that wherever you go, His grace will always guide you.
The path to attaining salvation passes through the experience of unfitness, or rather vanity and inadequacy. The idols of affection, success, or recognized creativity collapse, and the space of expectation and the need for a return to the roots of one's formation opens up. The same parabola from the amusement factory, divertimentificio, I don't know how to translate this word in English, amusement factory. The same parabola from the divertimentificio to the quiet of a more interior dimension leads Tondelli from the great postmodern capital to his small province, to his little town of Correggio, in Reggio Emilia. Certainly, Tondelli had a conflicted relationship with this small town. The climate of the town seemed to him cramped, closed, very provincial, an environment from which to escape along the highway to the North Sea to pursue his dream of adventure, as it is described in other libertines. However, despite the reaffirmed separation from one's root, the same novel bears witness to how the umbilical cord that kept Tondelli united with his little town was never, ever broken. One's own land has a smell that is capable of offering an awareness of one's origins. He wrote, profound awareness of being composed of that fog and of those vapors that the countryside emanates on certain days of the year. However, immersed in the American and metropolitan myth, Tondelli must recognize the inescapable need to graft himself onto the experience and lives of those who have gone before him. The detachment from home does not mark a real departure. Tondelli never really left Correggio. It was an evasive detachment, eager for adventure, that is, for a future, which nevertheless will bring him back home to Correggio, to his affections, to the little temple he has always seen from his own balcony. His is a journey homeward. The novel Separate Rooms is the only one which was translated into English in England. But the translation is not very good, so it has to be. There's work here for Michael Moore. So the novel Separate Rooms is characterized by a more explicitly Christian dimension. It is the most searing novel for the writer, who in a letter to his French publisher writes, "I'm working on camere separate, separate rooms, literally tearing it out of my skin." Much of Tondelli's soul in his desires and fears flows into this novel. At its center is the relationship between Leo and Thomas, experienced in separation, which is the real theme of the book. Thomas is dead, and Leo lives in a never-ending and final elaboration of this grief, in the continuous memory of the past, straining to find lost time. Here we grasp at least some relevant emergencies. First, Leo feels an inescapable religious vocation. He loves God's loving and angry language in the prophet Hosea. How do you say Hosea? Ponders the metaphor whereby God chooses to conceive his people from the womb of a prostitute, sulla metafora per cui Dio sceglie di concepire il suo popolo dal ventre di una prostituta, and considers the fact that God addresses his son with the language of a lover when he sees him stooping over little Israel to teach him to walk, holding his hand, or even senses God's wrath at the betrayal and deafness with which his love is returned. In these moments, Leo senses in himself his own religious vocation as something that cannot be renounced. This is what he wrote. And in his silent prayer, I'm quoting the novel, and in his silent prayer, he was aware of involving his entire sexuality. The link between prayer and sexuality in this novel is at the core of his message. Leo, wrote Tondelli, celebrates as liturgy life itself. He uses the word liturgy for talking about life. And his devotion consists in an attitude of observation, contemplation, and listening, an observing and contemplating attitude which has to do with his very way of being. This is prayer. He senses the presence of the sacred as something tangible in reality, something on which his gaze rests with devotion. It's kind of a definition of contemplation. It resonates a lot into myself when I resonated a lot when I read it for the first time, and it's still there. Leo, the protagonist of Separate Rooms, remembers what a priest, friend of him, said to him. This is a nice expression that you find in the book in English. You have been bitten by the metaphysical bug. And he wrote that in English. A sentence repeated in the last lines of the novel. However, he is not always happy with his conversation with them, with the priests. Leo says,
I cannot love the religion of sackcloth and punishment. I would love the religion of fullness. I would like to be happy in my religion because I experience it like a biological need, like eating, like drinking, like making love.
But Tondelli seems to shout, "You do not seem to understand this. I'm trying to tell you all this sincerely, but you deny my very existence." This is why he has toned down his need for God, turning to religiosity and the sacredness of the human in general. You deny my very existence. This is what he screams from the lines of his novel. The experience of sexed corporeality becomes a figure of transcendence. And even most lyrical pages about love depict two men. Tondelli said in an interview, I have always repeated ad nauseam, he uses Latin, ad nauseam, that I did not believe in the existence of homosexual writing, which means that he was talking about love. In the same interview, he said,
The three erotic moments in this novel are, in my opinion, three absolutely religious moments. They are moments in which I have tried to describe the meeting between two people not as self-knowledge, which is what usually happens in sexual practices, but as events that elevate the lovers toward something transcendent, something universal.
So the three erotic moments in the novel are the three absolutely religious moments. And he speaks about love not as something related to self-knowledge, but something that elevates the lovers towards something transcendent, something universal. Actually, in Rimini, the relationship between Bruno and Alred culminates in a prayer.
Bruno collapsed onto the bed and thanked God for teaching him through the body of Alred, the hidden and universal prayer of his creatures.
Thus Leo in separate rooms with Thomas.
Sometimes he would find himself praying while making love. His gaze spanned the nudity of the desired body with a chaste, even virginal devotion. He felt the miracle of lying next to the beauty of creation and being able to contemplate it in silence, being able to touch it with his fingertips, distractedly, in the same way that his gaze would caress the mountains during certain sunsets. The idea of possessing and dominating the other did not even cross his mind. He wanted everything to remain intact, with a feeling of gratitude and amplitude. Hours could pass in these reconnaissances during which his lover's body became the universe, with its constellations and worlds. And the times when it was Thomas who would get into him, running his eyes and hands over his body, he would also pray then, drifting off to sleep, because he felt the happiness of living his embarrassing finiteness as a value that gave peace to others.
He felt the happiness of living his embarrassing finiteness as a value that gave peace to others. On the first page of a volume on prayer written by Adriana Zarri, Tondelli notes in pencil, because I had this privilege to live hours, days in the private personal library of Pier Vittorio Tondelli. So I was able to browse all his books and every single pages. And I took down notes, all the notes he put in the book. And I realized that this book on prayer, written by Adriana Zarri, was very crucial for him. So on the first page of this volume he had in his own library, Tondelli notes in pencil, "To speak of prayer is to speak of love. This is why Camere Separate cannot leave out this discourse when it deals with the part of solitude and silence. Leo is devoted to loving the whole." Along these lines, chastity takes on value for Tondelli. He wrote, "Chastity is a mystical virtue for those who have chosen it, and perhaps the superhuman use of sexuality." It's a definition that Tondelli makes his own in reading a book of meditation on prayer, this book written by Adriana Zarri.
Virginity, in the theological sense, is in fact to be understood as a charisma that consists in a particular orientation of sex, in a particular way of placing one's relationship with God that cannot be created, or cannot be created by discipline or personal will.
So this is what Adriana Zarri wrote. This is what he underlined and translated in this definition of chastity as a mystical virtue. The writing takes on the notes of meditation, of an inner work of excavation. Tondelli takes, sometimes literally copies, some expressions from the book on prayer written by Zarri and pours them, these expressions, into his own writing, reinterpreting it in the line of discernment. The conscious rejection of certain experimentalism toward which the literary climate of the years in which Tondelli was writing was pushing finds in this meditative approach a confirmation and a seal. Separate Rooms describes an Easter experience of death and resurrection. Indeed, the death of Thomas in Camere Separate is read in light of the Passion of Christ. Leo recalls the figure of the dead Christ with the bleeding wounds, the crown of thorns, the holes of nails, and the lacerated side of the body, which he saw in the Good Friday procession in Correggio. To this figure he links, superimposing them almost photographically, both the image of Thomas, tortured and dead, and the foreshadowing of the already dead body of the protagonist Leo. Tondelli, author of these pages, already knew that the AIDS would not spare him. So Christ, Leo, and Thomas meet together, all three of them in abandonment, in their descent into hell. But for Tondelli, it's precisely, I'm quoting it, it's precisely in that elsewhere, which is the space of pain and abandonment, that God is hidden, the hidden God. Our insuperable loneliness has been overcome since it has been inhabited by God himself. In this experience, Leo recedes from doing away with the absolute, and the existential journey becomes crossing a long Holy Saturday, a journey through the dark night of desolation toward an acceptance of what he called the grain of life buried in his own mortality. Hope then, in spite of everything, remains alive, and of this grace the protagonist Leo will be the guardian. he cradles deep down this seed, keeping it warm, helping it to grow, and trying to grow with it. Here Tondelli is quoting the Gospel, the parable of the sower and the seed. Sensitivity to religion is in fact an underlying motive emerging between the lines in various places in Tondelli's work. I have not yet chosen my religion, which I admit I miss, and I will probably never find it, but I keep the doors open. Maybe religion will come and find me, Tondelli said. And later, in another interview, I consider Christianity the only possible religion, at least in my experience. It's a need that then transforms into accepting the sacred in man, in humanity, in suffering and in pain. One of the last books Tondelli read, if not the very last, was Giovanni Testori's translation of the first letter to the Corinthians. And through the underlined passages and the notes laboriously taken in pencil on the text with uncertain handwriting due to difficulties with his eyesight, we can guess what his inner and spiritual itinerary was in the last days. I found these notes in his own copy of the translation I found in his library. And at the end of the chapter 4, in a note, Tondelli calls his own funeral Messa in Dies Natalis, an expression that is traditionally used by the Catholic Church to refer to the day of death and to the birth into heaven. More importantly, however, in another note, we read,
I've always thought that writing could save history, maybe with time and hard work. My own history in an epic song. But literature does not save, ever. The only thing that saves is love, faith, and the consequences of grace.
The assonance, we don't know if only accidental, with what Jean Cocteau had written in one of his letters to Jacques Maritain is striking. This is what Cocteau wrote. Literature is impossible. We have to get out of it. And it's useless to try to get out of it with literature, because only love and faith allow us to get out of ourselves. It's good to recall again here Bruno's words in Rimini. I have always sought everything in life, truth and the absolute. I have always detested satisfied people. Thank you.
So this is the book we are presenting tonight. This is the cover. Just came out in Italy. And I forgot to tell you what's Father Spadaro's current job. I told you about his tenure at the Civiltà Cattolica. The Pope recently appointed him as Undersecretary of the Vatican Dicastery. In the Vatican, ministries are called dicasteries, right? Ministries are called dicasteries. There are a bit of mysteries too. So Father Spadaro is the Undersecretary of the Dicastery for Education and Culture. And now we have our respondent, and it's a great pleasure to welcome back to the Casa Alessandro Giammei, who is currently Professor of Italian at Yale University. But I'm proud to say that Casa Italiana was his first American abode. When he arrived here as a student at the Scuola Normale, where he studied with the chair of our department, Eugenio Ruffini, and we were setting up an exhibit, right, on Totti Scialoia, and he comes all enthusiastic. I wrote my dissertation on Totti Scialoia. Very good. Be ready. We're going to do an interview with you. And on the spot, we did an interview. And we understood right away that he was pretty brilliant. And he confirmed that, since from this department and from this house, we have looked at his career really taking off. And we are very happy to have him back to talk about Tondelli and to discuss with Father Spadaro. The main interest of Alessandro Giammei are, of course, on Italian contemporary literature and also on the reception of older author like Ariosto, that's one of his points of reference, but he wrote about the reception of Ariosto today, in the machine age, correct? So in cinema and comic books and many other expressions. So he told you about his interest for Totti Scialoia, a very important painter of the Scuola Romana, but he also co-wrote actually with our own Ara Merjan of our Department of Italian, Heretical Aesthetics, Pasolini on Painting, and many, many other publications and books. I just discovered today the one thing that, of course, he always manages to have a thing that surprises me every time I have to say something about him. So the last one is his upcoming study on Shakespeare's ghost in the philology and spiritism of fascist Italy. Spiritism of fascist Italy. We're going to have a chance to talk about that at some point. His last publication, in which he ventures in the style of a popular essay on gender and objects, is Cose da Maschi, published with Einaudi just a few months ago and presented here in New York at Rizzoli, if I remember correctly. But tonight, Alessandro is here with us to talk about Pier Vittorio Tondelli and to discuss with Father Spadaro. Please welcome Alessandro Giammei.
Thank you, Professor Albertini. It's always such a pleasure to be a casa. And thanks to Father Spadaro, I'm very grateful for... you leave me alone on the stage. I'm very sad. I was my favorite setting is when we all sit here. Now I'm like lecturing. So I grew up in Rome, and I went to school to the nuns, dalle suore, in elementary school. I like to read very much. I still do. And back then, I read the Bible a lot. And I remember being delighted. I was, I think, 5 or 6, reading the book of Samuel, the love between David and Jonathan, which appeared to me to be boyfriends. And I remember later on, maybe I was 7 or 8 when we first did our gita scolastica, so a school trip to the Vatican to see la Cappella Sistina and looking at those incredible frescoes. Now you can see, if you go and pay attention to this fresco, the most famous painting in Italy, probably, frescoed by a queer man, Michelangelo Buonarroti. You can see among the souls that are going to paradise, that are saved by Christ, 2 men who kiss on the lips. So, since I was very young, I felt very cool about being queer and being Catholic. And then I would say that it was the church, my experience with parrocchia and with some priests that made me doubt about this serenity and this coolness. And so I'm incredibly grateful to Father Spadaro to bring me back to that delight through his incredibly scholarly and precise and devoted reading of Pier Vittorio Tondelli, who experienced similar things that are kind of similar to the ones that I experienced as a kid. One of the most moving documents that Father Spadaro conjures from the archives of Tondelli is something that he wrote at 26 about being 16 and remembering his adolescence and talking about the fact that he didn't really care for Jesus because he cared more about God, and he imagined God as a boyfriend. Sono il fidanzatino di Dio. And there's no mocking, there's no satire. There's a deep engagement with religion that is confirmed by what Father Spadaro just told us, but also by the incredible bibliography, the documents that he shows us in this book, which is a very rich book. It's a thick book. And at the end, you see a very precise list of the books from that are quoted from Pier Vittorio Tondelli's library, and you find Bibles there, no? And you find marginalia on those Bibles. These are books, sacred texts that Tondelli engaged with very dearly. Actually, the tradition of queer authors, queer intellectuals in Italian, Italophone queer intellectuals in the peninsula is very old. Of course, Michelangelo, of course, Cellini, but then, of course, in the 20th century, and these are some of the names that appear in this book, not only Pier Vittorio Tondelli, but also Coccioli, an author that we tend to forget, an incredible writer that I think is partly translated into English out of print, but definitely is being republished in Italy by a very courageous press, and is an incredible author that was in touch with Tondelli and inspired by Tondelli, and he wrote later, and this is another document that I discovered from Father Spadaro's research, was not only inspired by, but he stated, without Pier Vittorio, I wouldn't have written the things that I wrote, and I think he never knew. Well, now he does, because he died. Giovanni Testori, but of course Pier Paolo Pasolini, Catholicism and Queerness. There's no other way to read these intellectuals. Suor Benedetta Carlini, I wrote down, from the 17th century, but then more recently, Michela Murgia, a dear friend of Father Spadaro and of mine, who died very recently, and who wrote a book called God Save the Queer, catechismo femminista, feminist catechism. All of this to say that one of the most generous gestures that Father Spadaro does with this book, besides making me feel like I'm back to the nuns and I'm 5 and everything is cool about myself, is to put Pier Vittorio Tondelli in the company of people that he knew and strangers that react correctly to his profile. Because the reception of Pier Vittorio Tondelli in Italian literature and Italian criticism and the history of Italian literature is very limited, it's a bit misleading. It tends to be either entirely obsessed with the scandal of his prose and with the censorship that he received and with his biography, and trying to figure out things about figure out hints in his prose that can tell us more about his lived experiences. Or, and this is the way I encountered Tondelli as a student in college, and actually from the textbook in high school, really, as the animator of, let's say, the inventor of something that in Italy is called, in the publishing world, giovanilismo, which is the trend of collecting never published before young authors that are somehow striking, somehow first or unexpected. A very famous case that was inspired by Tondelli's work was, after his death, the anthology I Cannibali, pulp Italian literature in the late 90s. The fact that Tondelli collected this, looked for and was reached by young authors that were never published and that were very, in a way, come si dice, pirateschi, they were pirates of the letters, and that he coached them and that he curated them in a very maternal, in a very caring way as an editor, made him a sort of epitome of the postmodern, not only giovanilismo, but also leadership in being new, in embracing with euphoria postmodernism as an option, a positive option. Really, what Father Spadaro does in this book is to remind us of the solitude of this figure. Because, of course, it is weird to be queer and so spiritual. And of course, dying at 36. I'm 35. Next year, I'm 36. And I cannot imagine how incredible to have such a short life that is so meaningful and so full of life. Ecco, dying at that age of the quintessential pandemic of that era, the AIDS pandemic, is an element that puts you in a state of solitude. One could make a little network of Italian intellectuals that had the same experience. I'm thinking of poet Patrizia Vicinelli and poet and translator Dario Villa. Dario Villa was in touch with Pier Vittorio Tondelli. In all 3 cases, what is striking is that this disease was not lived as something that was to be narrated, something that was to be shared, but as to quote Montale, un rispettabile prendere le distanze, something that makes you go away from the consesso dei vivi and progressively die alone. And this is what happened to Tondelli. So Father Spadaro put Tondelli back in the company of strangers where he belongs, and also reminded us of his solitude. Another thing that he did was to treat with and this, I'm very grateful for that, because it was wonderful to read this and find it confirmed at every page. His treatment of love with the highest possible dignity, without forgetting the blasphemous aspects of his writing. And in fact, the first chapter, I think, maybe the second chapter, is devoted to Tondelli's language, and this language is filled with lurid things, it's true. But love, even in the pits of hell, that in Les Saisons en Enfer, that Tondelli reaches, remains a force for transcendence. And this made me think of, possibly the most famous queer novel of the 20th century in Italy is The Gold Rimmed Spectacles, Gli Occhiali d'Oro, by Giorgio Bassani. But the queerest sentence that Giorgio Bassani wrote is in Il Giardino dei Finzi Contini, The Garden of the Finzi Contini, his most famous novel, where the plot of that novel is remembered by the narrator. And in that moment, the narrator says, l'amore giustifica e santifica tutto, virgola, persino la pederastia. And he's talking about the fact that, and he uses a syntagm from a letter of Paul, giustifica e santifica tutto, which is, it's exactly what we find today in inclusive signposts in front of houses. Love is love, and it's what Caravaggio was inspired from when he painted Love Conquers All. And I feel like Father Spadaro did a wonderful job reminding us how love transcends questions of sexuality, transcends biography, transcends the plot of novels even, and in a way is always queer, because it queers our experience of diversity, of religion itself. It makes us think of syncretism in a more meaningful way. So before I invite everybody to join the conversation, I wanted to say two things. One is that there is also a song by Lil Nas X, another fundamental episode of reception of Michelangelo and queer Catholicism, that is called Panini. So Panini, Paninari, we are in a realm of semantics that I'm very excited about. And the other is that I want to tell you, those of you who can read Italian, go get this book and get haste to the end, because the last document that Father Spadaro conjures from the archive of Tondelli is especially moving. And it is this cartolina, this postcard, that Tondelli sent to this legendary editor, Aldo Tagliaferri, who used to be the greatest force for good in the Feltrinelli editions towards experimentalism and new literature. And I love him. I met him because I work on some very obscure authors that he curated, including an incredible translator of the Bible, Emilio Villa, who was an experimental poet and a crazy man. And Corrado Costa, I was so delighted that you found Corrado Costa. I am the only person in the world who writes about Corrado Costa. Now, Corrado Costa was a pataphysicist and a lawyer, a communist, an experimental writer. And he met with Tondelli and helped him and guided him. Aldo Tagliaferri is still alive. I think he's 100 years old, and he's super lucid. And he actually spent some time at Yale in the 50s with, Paul de Man, I think. And he receives this postcard, which is one of the last things that I think Tondelli wrote with his hand. And in this postcard, there is a very obscure message that insists on islands, on 3 islands on a sort of archipelago of solitudes, islands that are not Ithaca, they're not islands where you can return, but islands where you get lost and you die. And he evokes the name of Diomedes, Diomede, the Isole Tremiti. Now, you read this postcard, it doesn't mean anything to me. What is incredible is the exercise of philology, of exegesis, of care. That Father Spadaro devoted to this text, as if it was, I don't want to say a sacred text, but a text that deserves the closest of attention. And through ornithology, lexicology, philology, geography, and geology, and most of all, Greek mythology, and Dante, he makes us understand how that is, in a way, the testament of Pier Vittorio Tondelli, and how that little obscure document justifies his entire historical narration, Father Spadaro historical narration, starting from juvenile notes and ending on this tragic, but at the same time revealing and saving, in a way, positive, optimistic note. So I would like to start the conversation by asking Father Spadaro if he can tell us more about the experience of working directly with documents like this, the surprise of finding them, and also la lunga fedeltà that he devoted to this author, considering that I think maybe it was one of his first works of right immediately after the death, and also one of your earliest works of scholarship, and now getting to this, and always being close to the sources, to the library, to the marginalia, to the traces of his work, and how it is to find, like, when did you find that postcard, and how long did it take you to write that incredible interpretation of it? Thank you so much for your attention.
Spadaro, who wrote this book about Tondelli, and I'm so glad that we invited Alessandro Giammei to talk with Father Spadaro. Thank you so much to both of you. So you have already a question?
Yeah, it's a very complicated question. I mean, the answer could last forever. So I started reading Tondelli by chance, because I was writing a book about the meaning of the voyage, the travel, the tracce profonde, the voyage in the imaginarium of the Western imaginarium. And so I read by chance the first pages of Camere Separate in the Feltrinelli bookstore in Naples. I didn't know almost anything about Tondelli. I knew just that he died in 1991, and I read Camere Separate in 1992. So I was kept by what he wrote there and the meaning of the trip, which is very moving. Then I read the book, and I was really kept by the book, because I found quest for God, for an absolute, for something that really saves your life, and at the same time a profound sense of abandonment and solitude. So how love can save your life. So this was the question. And how he was able to use religious the images for talking about the human experience. That really struck me a lot. And I was studying theology at those times. So in a sense, I studied theology, the first 3 years of theology, for my first degree, together with Tondelli. So I started reading Tondelli from the last book, Camere Separate, to the first one, Altri libertini, Other libertines. And that was a blessing, because if I had read Altri libertini as a first book, I would have stopped there, probably. But I was able to understand the meaning of that book, starting from the end of the parable. And going back to so I really read Camere Separate, and then Rimini, and then Dinner Party, and so on. And the last one I read was Altri libertini. So I was really kept by that, and I wrote my first article for La Civiltà Cattolica in 1994 about Tondelli. You know, La Civiltà Cattolica is a very peculiar review, and the articles are reviewed by the Secretariat of State in the Vatican before the publication. And the article was approved as it was, so no changes at all. And the day afterwards, all the Italian newspapers wrote about that article. thought that was a huge surprise for me. I was interviewed by the Corriere della Sera. I was nobody. I mean, I was a student of theology. So I realized that there was something over there. So there was something that involved the meaning of my faith. Not just my life, my faith, my way of understanding the work of God in a human life. So I went deeper, and I was immediately invited by the Correggio, the city of Correggio, for talking about Tondelli, and I was one of the founders of the Centro di Documentazione, so the Center for Documentation about his work. So we started an initiative together with a young German scholar, which gathered together students of Tondelli from all over the world. Some of them from, many of them from Italy, but also some from other countries in Europe. And so I went deeper and deeper, and I met his brother, and then his father, his mother, and all the family, and then all his friends. So I got into his life, the personal life. So I felt the smell of his writing. I don't know how to put it. And so then, knowing quite well his family, they trust me. I was very grateful for that. So they allowed me to work in his own library, and leaving me alone in the library. Their home. Their own home. I mean, their library was in their house, in their own house. And they have been very generous with me. And that was a huge experience. So I was able to read, to have in my hands every single book he read. And I realized that he underlined many passages, and I tried to, in the book you find them. So he put notes, but also underlined passages, and I realized where the roots of his writing were. So it was an adventure, was a real adventure, and that helped me to understand better life, and I realized how universal was his own experience, which is able to talk to everybody. So was something that was not related just to my work as a scholar, as a literary critic for a Catholic magazine, but it was that an experience that really affected my life, and in a sense changed even my way of understanding, even the cultural events and the 80s. I was born in 1966, so I lived the 80s, but I found a key for understanding what I lived. So I'm very grateful for this experience, which is not just a scholarly experience, but it's a human and spiritual experience. What really struck me was at some point I was able to say when he read a book and why he read that book, and I even surprised even his family, saying, and his own friends. But the most beautiful moment was when I found the notes handwritten in the last book he read. So the translation of the Lettera ai Corinzi, written by the story. And he had in mind to write a book called Sante Messe, Holy Masses. And he never wrote that book, but I think that those notes are part of this project. And in those notes, he expresses himself and the feeling he had at the end of his life, considering that he spent all his life for literature, but he realized that literature does not save. What really saves is love.
This is Dante, basically, right? And I love the fact that you underline the smell of his writing, because smell is such a protagonist of this book. You insist so much on metaphorical smells, on the smells that, with which, for instance, Tondelli let us know from his literature his confidence, like, no, confidence is not, familiarity, la confidenza con la Chiesa, the familiarity with the environment of the church, incenses, that then become the incenses in his room that he uses for, like, with his fascination for Eastern culture, but also the smell of the papers, the smell of his actual objects, and that is extremely exciting. And of course, it makes sense that you started with La letteratura di viaggio, because of course, it's a road trip. Like, people, when they think of Camere separate and American literature, they always think of Giovanni's room, obviously, and they're right, but also on the road. Like, I'm thinking about the fact that Italian postmodern queer writing is always about voyage, like Fratelli d'Italia, and like there is an element of, yes, where do you go and you never come back? And this kind of, sì, viaggio dell'eroe. Grazie. Shall we open it to the, yes.
Yes. There is a microphone for you.
Hi, Father Spadaro. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to read the book. I have a question as regards other senses. I'm excited to read more about smell. I was thinking more about, especially that we had an actor here, about cinema and the sort of hearing Tondelli out loud, because I'll share an experience. I'm happy to share, I've been working on a translation of Camere separate, not Camere separate, of Altri libertini. And there are many funny moments, but what I think is my favorite funny moment is in Mimi e Strioni. For those of you very quickly who haven't read it, one of the characters who's talking about this collective of her 4 friends, she's the narrator the whole way through, and she reminds you every now and again, there's a little comment, and it's me, Pia. Son sempre la Pia, io la Pia. Which is a very funny tick. And then you realize she's talking about herself, and this is sort of religious or not too, but she's like, me. She's either saying her name or she's saying, me, the pious one. I never would have thought to change a name in a translation, but it kind of feels like there's something going on there. Anyway, if you could just, if there's anything about hearing him out loud, because that only came to me when I started reading myself and him more out loud. But thinking about the way he sounds, and even the way things might look, because there is, of course, so much that feels cinematic. So in addition to the smells, what are the sounds and the visions of Tondelli too?
Thank you.
Well, there's just an expression that cine occhio, il cine occhio. I don't know how to translate it, how to put it into English. The sign, but I don't know. The
Cineai,
film eye, or something like that. So his way of seeing things was the way, it was a cinematic way of seeing things, which means that he always saw the reality through a lens. So is as if he. The real experience intimidated him. This is why he liked to be isolated, also because he never coincides with the experience he describes. So there is always a step back in his relationship to the reality, to the experience, a kind of a certain grade of separation between him and reality. But at the same time, the lens was his way of approaching reality, so to create a relationship with it. And this lens quite often is made by irony. And probably is a way for defending him, for the power of the experience, which sometimes is overwhelming. And the language is of Altri libertini, for example. Good luck, because it's terrible. I mean, it's almost, for me, it's impossible to translate Altri libertini into English. The real experience is a kind of a magma. So if you touch it, you burn your hands. So you need something for managing it. So for me, his way of seeing things, the cinematic way of seeing things, is a way of defending, at the same time is a way of approaching.
And he wanted to be a cinematic critic, right? And he was obsessed, and he went. But I just wanted to, like, very quickly.
You can put the questions also to him because he,
No, I'm not.
he read.
I just wanted to know. You've never seen him in real life?
No.
That's amazing. No, only videos and posthumous. That's amazing.
But he did have ambitions. He wrote scripts.
He wrote scripts, yeah.
And for theater.
And he famously worked only for saving enough money to go to Venice and see that, right? Like there is this cute detail of those years also, what he meant the festival.
Yes.
I just want to know what was on the postcard. I didn't quite understand. That last postcard was very fascinating to me.
I want him to answer to that question. Because
It sounded like this enigmatic.
It is incredibly enigmatic. So it's a message that he wrote that if you read it without the help of Father Spadaro, it doesn't mean anything. He says, tre isole, tre miti, tutto è perduto, isole comprese. You speak Italian?
I don't.
3 islands, 3 myths. Everything is lost, even the islands. Trapianti inconsolabili di Diomede, which is intranslatable, among the inconsolable crying of Diomedes. It's Diomedes, but also it's something else. Islands without coming back. Islands a perdere. Islands to be wasted. A perdere means it's like something that you make knowing that you will be wasting, losing it. Isole perdere. Isole perdute. Islands lost. At the center of each archipelago, there's almost always one island that is steep, arid, and uninhabited. Maybe there's some plants of capers in it, and we call it Capraia o Isola delle Capre. So the Capers Island, the goats Capra Island, but really it is the island of the scapegoat. And there is where you will find me in a hug, Pier. So you read it, you wanted to cry, but also you want to say, what's the goat, what's the Diomede? And it is a ciphered message that Aldo Tagliaferri could understand because he was the editor of Tondelli all his life, and he discovered Tondelli and coached him into, his first novel was a disaster. It was like 1 million pages of ramblings, but Tagliaferri saw the talent. I was like, here it is, let's talk. What are you reading? You should read this other. You should trust religion. You should trust your instincts, your education, blah, blah, blah. And so they spent, not much time. His life was very short. But in the end, he was able to decipher it. And Father Spadaro gives this, the Diomede has to do with birds. It has to do with a myth. It has to do with Dante. It has to do with the geography, Diomede and Ulisse. And the conclusion, and maybe you can say more about this, but really the conclusion in the book is Tondelli was not Ulysses. He realized he could not be Ulysses. There's no coming back for him. He's a different hero. It's Diomedes who dies alone in the Tremiti. Esatto. Which is Christ-like. And yes,
yeah, exactly.
So moving. And also in Italian, abbarbicato in un abbraccio. It's poetic.
I think we couldn't end on a better note, and of course it's in this guy. No, it's perfect, bellissimo. La conclusione, basta. We're not going to say anything else. And of course, in disguise, the question came from Mary Card, that is fantastic, American writer and poet, and I'm so happy that she's with us here to talk about Tondelli. Thanks so much to all of you. Thank you, Father Spadaro, and thank you, Alessandro Giammei, for being here.